Welcome to our first week in this new class. I'm so excited to teach this class this semester and so happy we can finally offer a course on structural equation modeling. In today's lecture, we're going to cover the basics of structural equation modeling and introduce you to it so you are prepared to start learning about it. I'm so excited to teach this class. This is a class I've been wanting our department to offer for many years, and I'm so excited we can finally get it going. If you want to just take a look at how important structural equation modeling is to learn, take a look at any of the most recent issues of Journal of Marital and Family Therapy or Journal of Marriage and Family, JMF, or Journal of Family Relations, or any of the top psych journals. Go through there and just take a gander about how many articles that have quantitative methodology use structural equation modeling, and how many you'll find that use hierarchical regression. What you will find is that structural equation modeling has become much more prevalent, and it's kind of hard to find articles that have hierarchical regression. You'll still see those with ANOVAs because there are some important places for that in research, but largely people are doing structural equation modeling. And there's a few reasons for this that I'm going to kind of go over today. But this class is incredibly important if you want to be competitive on the job market for an academic position, or if you want any quantitative research methodology that you're doing to be able to be published in a higher tier journal. Just moving from hierarchical regression to doing structural equation modeling, that alone can help you to get it in a stronger journal, but also get it in more quickly. And so this is very, very important. A little bit about me. I've done a lot of SEM analyses in the past. I have TA'd in structural equation modeling classes back when I was a doc student. And the majority of my research has been using structural equation modeling. So this is something I'm very familiar with and very excited to teach this. So I want to talk to you a little bit about my approach to this course. This course is designed for researchers, and specifically social science researchers, not statisticians. So we're going to see a lot less of this on the left here, doing equations or those kind of things. So we did a bit of that in advanced statistics and multivariate. We're not going to use a lot of this when we're covering structural equation modeling, namely because in order to get into the statistics of this, we have to get into matrix algebra, which is beyond a lot of what we're prepared to do, and it's just not as helpful for you to know how to use it well. And so less of this and much more of this. Endogenous equals arrow ends into it. Mean means you add them up and divide them by the total. And follow this syntax I give you in order to, or this formula for the syntax in order to do what you want to do. So we're going to be focusing a lot more on conceptualization and literacy and knowing how and when to use this as a tool. So my goals for you in this class is to reduce your fear, first of all. Reduce the fear of doing structural equation modeling, reduce the fear of statistics or quantitative research methodologies, and along with that, increase your confidence. So I want to decrease your fear, increase your confidence as a researcher, and your ability to run your own statistics and to write your own statistics, and also to be able to consume. So that third goal, being able to develop literacy for structural equation methods and results, so that as you read articles, you can understand them, you can understand their weaknesses and their strengths, and you can better understand what they have actually done in that study. This will also help you because for those of you that want to get on reviewing journals, journals are always looking for people who can read those methods and results sections especially, and having literacy for SEM goes a long ways to help you with that. The fourth piece, understand the rationale and application of SEM. So know when is it appropriate to use, when it is not appropriate to use, and how to develop better and more sophisticated research studies and hypotheses along with that. The fifth piece is develop skills required to use the M+ software. So understanding how to use this software, how to write syntax for it, because this is the software of choice for many researchers in doing structural equation modeling. And then the sixth piece is to conduct SEM analyses on your own and interpret results to further your own research. So one of the major components of this course will be developing a publishable manuscript using structural equation modeling using a data set of your choice. So being able to do your own analyses so that when you get to dissertation, if your research questions beg for quantitative methodology, that you can feel comfortable developing a study and an analysis using structural equation modeling. That will open up the kinds of research questions you can ask, and it will also help you to answer them in more sophisticated ways. So I want to cover a few things that I think are really important and that Klein highlights as well in the textbook that are really important in order to successfully learn about structural equation modeling. So these are things that if you have in the back of your brain, or at least have a good foundation on, your ability to learn structural equation modeling is going to become even better. So first of all, know your area. Any researcher, in order to understand how to do good research, needs to know their own area. So begin with a strong familiarity with the theoretical and empirical literature in your research area. And what's most important is the bookends of that. So the seminal works and the most recent work. If you understand the seminal works, you understand the basis of the field and what are the most important concepts and measures and the most important findings in the field. And the latest work will tell you where it is at currently. So understanding those bookends really helps you to have a strong grounding and foundation in your research area. According to Klein, he said that this is the single most important thing you could bring to SEM because everything must be guided by your domain knowledge. When you're working on your models from beginning with specification to developing alternative models and interpreting the final results, all of this is based on your knowledge of your research area. You will not be able to develop good, interesting, sophisticated questions if you do not understand your area really well. So it starts with knowing your area. The third piece of this is be a researcher first and foremost, not a statistician or a computer geek. First and foremost, you need to be a great researcher and really use your curiosity. And a good researcher reads their area and knows where their area is at. Second, know your measures. We talked a lot about this in multivariate, but garbage in, garbage out. Quantitative research is all about those fundamental issues of measurement. Your research is only as good as the reliability and validity of the items and the measures within that research. So we need measures that have good psychometric characteristics, good reliability, and good validity. Everything starts with that. Your data is only as good as the psychometrics of your constructs. So when you're working on selecting your items and your measures and developing composite variables, it all goes back to the psychometrics. Are those good measures? Do they represent the constructs you hope them to represent? And you'll know that if you know your area really well. You'll know the common measures. You'll know how these different constructs are measured. And so that way you can have good psychometric principles. So go back to advanced quantitative research methods and really know what makes good methodology for your measures. Third piece, know your fundamentals. So we're going to cover this in our next lecture. But in order to do SEM, you have to have a strong foundation in regression, specifically OLS, that's your linear regression. You need to understand how to correctly interpret results, especially around statistical significance. So going back to your notes in multivariate and advanced statistics, and understanding how to correctly interpret factor analysis and regression is really important. And the third, data screening and measure selection. So everything that we did in multivariate around how to clean your data, how to select good measures, how to code and recode, and how to create composite variables, all of that is necessary in order to do structural equation modeling. So if you need to brush up on any of that, go back to those lectures and notes that you have from advanced statistics and multivariate. Many statistical estimates in SEM are interpreted the same as OLS regression. So that means having a strong basis in regression is absolutely essential in order to do SEM well. And lastly, use the best computer in the world. That's you, that's your brain. So Klein said that it is you, the researcher, who must evaluate the degree of support for your hypotheses, explain any unexpected findings, relate the results to those of previous studies, and reflect on the implications of the findings for future research. These are all matters of judgment. No amount of proficiency will do you any good if you do not think. So the most important tool that you have is your brain. So making sure that you develop good, thoughtful questions, making sure that you read through and really understand what these results mean, and making sure that you are able to convey those results and understand the implications of those results. So as you move to get ready to learn about structural equation modeling, these are the most important pieces for you to prepare to learn. Number one, know your area. Number two, know your measures. Number three, know your fundamentals. And number four, use your brain. Now, the next piece that we're going to cover is a little introduction to SEM. So I gave you a pretty brief introduction to structural equation modeling at the end of multivariate statistics. I do recommend you go back and rewatch that video, but I'm going to give you another introduction, and I'm going to try and do it in a little bit different way as we begin this course. So first of all, structural equation modeling, what is it? It's a family of statistical approaches and really a methodology that takes a confirmatory approach to hypothesis testing. So a lot of multivariate statistics take an exploratory approach. SEM is all confirmatory, or at least mostly confirmatory approaches. So we are taking our hypotheses and confirming if those are in fact true. There are two important pieces to SEM. Number one is that causal processes under study are represented by a series of equations. So when we're developing an SEM model, we're essentially developing a series of equations by proposing that these are the relationships of the variables. Number two, that these relationships that we're proposing can be modeled through a drawing to give a clearer conceptualization of what you are testing. So we can take what we're wanting to do and display it pictorially for what we're trying to test. These are three things that your readings identify, and especially Klein and Byrne both talk about, are things that really set SEM apart from traditional approaches. And what they mean by traditional approaches are OLS regression, logistic regression, and largely ANOVA. So these three pieces are the most important that they kind of highlight. Number one, it takes a confirmatory rather than exploratory approach. And it requires us to make hypotheses and confirm whether those are the way that they are rather than exploring. Number two, traditional multivariate approaches do not make explicit estimates of error variance parameters. This is one of the, in my opinion, one of the most important pieces of this. When you're conducting statistics and SPSS using linear regression or ANOVA or those pieces, they just kind of assume that error vanishes. When you see those error terms in those models, they're looking at the error of the model, not the error of the actual variables themselves. They assume that those variables, SPSS assumes that those variables are measured without any error. So just keep in mind, whenever you're seeing error terms in SPSS, those are errors within the model. So looking at the error, like in linear regression, for example, is looking at the average error from each point to the line that it has regressed them onto. It's not looking at the error within the actual variables themselves. In SEM, it actually makes explicit estimates of error variance for each of your variables in that model. Number three, and this is the other huge one, is that SEM can model both observed and unobserved variables. So for the first time, you can actually measure the unmeasurable, measure what you cannot observe, or more accurately measure things. So sometimes we make certain variables when we're just doing multivariate regression as manifest variables when they are much better measured using latent constructs. So these are the things that set SEM apart from traditional importance. The three of to me, what are the most important pieces that sets it apart? So now I'm going to go through and kind of cover some of the basic concepts and vocabulary that we use in SEM. I've already used some of these terms today. So the first is manifest versus latent variables. So manifest, or also known as observed variables, those are measures that are directly observed. So those are line items on your in SPSS. Each of these variables here have an item and a measure with it. And manifest variables can be a single item or it can be a composite variable that you've summed or mean together from a bunch of variables together. And when we're drawing this out pictorially in SEM, we represent this with a square or rectangle. Latent constructs are unobserved variables. So these are theoretical constructs that either cannot be observed or are best modeled as unobserved. And then the way that we operationally define this is by taking observed or manifest variables that represent or well represent aspects of this unobserved variable. So we may take depression and make that an unobserved or a latent construct, and then take items that measure different aspects of depression and bring those together to create this latent construct. So the manifest variables that load onto this latent construct are we call indicators, and this is doing a confirmatory factor analysis. And we're going to cover CFA in pretty good detail a little bit later in the semester. And we represent latent constructs as with a circle or an oval. So when you're drawing, circle, square, or a square or a rectangle is a manifest variable. A circle or an oval is a latent variable. In M plus at least, in M plus, and most oftentimes they represent error or residual terms using a small circle, and they usually put an E or error in there as well. A line with a single arrowhead at the end is a predictive relationship. This is also called a path coefficient. This is, in most situations, either going to be a regression coefficient or a factor loading when you're doing a confirmatory factor analysis. But for the most part, these are going to be regression coefficients, linear regression. A line with an arrowhead on both ends, this is usually drawn with a curved line, is going to represent a correlation or covariance among two variables. So here's an example of this where you can see you have this correlation between these two observed variables at the beginning. You have predictive or path coefficients. These are going to be regression coefficients between these first two variables and then the two dependent variables here. And then you have your error terms here. And in this model, these error terms are correlated. So one of the cool things you can do in SEM is you can actually correlate error terms, so you can account for shared variance in error between variables. And here's an example of a latent variable. This is an example of a confirmatory factor analysis. So one thing you'll notice is that the arrows go out from the factor. This is how you know that these are indicators of the factor rather than things that the factor are predicting. So like this is financial situation, and we measure income and debt to income ratio and how much somebody believes that they're making end meets. And then these four items, indicators, make up and then create the measure for this unobserved measure of financial situation. And then plus we'll actually create a scale and measure this item based on these factors. We'll go into CFAs in a few weeks when we get into a little bit more detail about confirmatory factor analysis and SEM. Some other basic concepts, we don't really use the terms independent and dependent variable, and mainly that's because we have variables that are both independent and dependent variables in the model, so it doesn't make sense to use that language anymore, but rather we use the terms exogenous and endogenous variables. Exogenous variables are variables that are at the very beginning, so these are variables that have nothing being, they aren't predicted by any other variables in our model. And endogenous have an arrow going into it, so that means they are being predicted by or explicitly, their causes are presumed to be explicitly represented in the model by other variables in that model. So going back to our example, or a different example here, we have our exogenous variables at the beginning. Exogenous, they're from the outside, they're at the beginning. And in M plus and SEM, whenever you're doing this, you will always correlate. And in fact, if you don't explicitly do this, M plus will do it automatically for you, but it will correlate the covariance between your exogenous variables. And there are some reasons for that we don't need to get into, just understand that it does that. And then you can see we have 3 endogenous variables here, as we have arrows going into them, and they are being predicted by other variables within the model. So you'll also hear us use the term measurement model and structural model. A full structural equation model has both latent and manifest variables in it. If it does not have any latent variables in it, it is just simply called a path analysis, where it has only manifest variables. So a full structural equation model has a measurement and a structural part. The measurement part of that, or the measurement model, is the part which relates to indicators and manifest variables to latent variables. So it's all about, I'll show you an example of what this looks like in a moment. And then the structural model is the part that relates to latent variables one to another. So the measurement model is indicators and manifest variables to latent constructs, and the structural part is the relationship of the latent variables one to another. So here is an example of a full structural equation model, or a full structural model. So you can see here we have 3 latent constructs: therapeutic alliance, therapist efficacy, and dyadic adjustment. Therapeutic alliance is made up of goals, tasks, and bonds. Our therapist efficacy is made up of 3 items: the therapist's fidelity to the treatment model, their number of hours of training, and then also their total experience as a therapist, the number of years that they have been in practice. Dyadic adjustment is made up of, this is an actual measure that you can find, and I've used in my own research. This is a relationship functioning variable made up of consensus, cohesion, and satisfaction. So these are items that are measured that then make up dyadic adjustment. So in this example here, we would be looking at the therapeutic alliance and the therapist's efficacy and how that predicts dyadic adjustment. And you can have measures pre and post treatment, but we'd be considering like post treatment, what that looks like. So the measurement model piece of this is each of these 3 pieces and squares here, where we have the blue, the red, and the green. Each of those make up the measurement model. And if we were going to test the measurement model, and again, we're going to get into this when we cover confirmatory factor analyses, we do 2 things. One, we would test each of these CFAs, alliance, therapeutic efficacy, and dyadic adjustment on their own each. And then we'd also kind of test them together, just correlating each of these 3 together, so not doing any predictive relationships, just to kind of test and make sure we're looking at it all together as well as individually, and making sure all of that works. The structural part is the actual relationships between these 3 latent variables. So again, full structural model, all of them together. The measurement model is just the CFA part of that, just the latent construct with the items that it's loading onto. And then 3, the structural part is just that piece of the latent constructs and their relationships to each other. So a few other basic concepts and definitions we're using in structural equation modeling. Parameter, you'll hear us use this term, and you hear me use this term a lot. This term will become very important when we get into identification and making sure that we have adequate degrees of freedom to run our model, and that we're not over or under justified in doing that. So a parameter is any path, correlation, or variances in the model. So anything that has an arrow going into it, and then also our error terms in there. So our error terms, and then all of our arrows in the model, those are our parameters that we're interested in. So when we get to identification, we'll talk a lot more about this, because you're going to have to actually count up your parameters and determine where your degrees of freedom are. There's a really simple formula for how you do that, and we'll cover that when we do that, and you'll be doing some of that on your lab assignment as well. And then with parameters, we have different types of parameters. So parameters can be freely estimated. This is likely what you're going to be doing the majority of your work, just letting them to be estimated as they are in the model. You can have a fixed parameter where you actually set it to a certain value, and that's important when we're doing CFAs and in a few other instances. And then constrained. So constrained parameters become really important when we're doing actor-partner interdependence modeling, so when we're doing dyadic data analyses, because what you can actually do is constrain 2 paths to be equal to each other, and then see if the model gets significantly worse. If it does, then that means those 2 paths are significantly different from each other. If the model doesn't get significantly worse at all, then that means that those 2 paths are actually the same. So you can say for like men and women, this relationship between those two variables is actually the same thing. Or you can say that it's actually significantly different, that for men it's worse, or for women it's worse, however the data looks. So those are the basics of introducing you to M+, and a lot of the terminology we'll be using throughout the semester. The next thing I want to do is talk a little bit how to actually use the M+ program. So first, some syntax basics. There are 10 commands that are used, and the commands you can think of as the big blocks of areas where you're going to be doing things. And I'm going to show you the commands. Really there are 10, but really you're only going to be using 4, maybe 5 of these in this class. And pretty much anytime you're doing SEM, you're just going to be using those 4 or 5. Order of these doesn't matter. It just matters that they're there. One thing to kind of keep note of is that S+ can't read anything past 90 columns. The program just stops. So when you're looking at how many lines you have things, you just don't want to go too far. Just create a break. Or most especially when you're using your file, making sure your file name isn't too long and not in too many subfolders that it creates a file location that is too long for M+ to read. One other piece about this too is that when you're doing syntax, is, are, and the equal signs are synonymous. It doesn't matter if you use is, are, or the equal signs. All 3 of those things, M+ goes, it's the same thing. So you'll see sometimes examples will say like variables are, variables is, or variables equals. It doesn't matter, those 3 things are synonymous. So the most common commands that we're going to use with these, the first is title. And the title is just the name of the file. What are you naming this file? And Plus just wants to know what you want to name it. It can be important when you're doing this, just as we've talked about in multivariate, to renaming your files as you do different analyses and maintaining those so you can compare, go back, and know what you've done. Keep track of your breadcrumbs as you've done your work. Data is, it identifies the name and the location of the data file. I'll show you an example what this looks like as we get to the end here. Variable, that command is just what variables you're using from this data file. So there are 3 kind of subcommands you're going to use. The first is names are, what are you going to call the variables? Use variables are, so use variables is like what variables are you actually using from this data set? If you're using all of them, you can just say use variables are all, or use variables equals all, or use variables is all. If you're only using a few of them or not all of them, you have to tell them which ones you're using. And the last piece is missingness. So what is your missing measured at? And the example I always give is -99. So you say missing are all. So all of my variables have been coded, all of the missingness and all of my variables has been coded to -99. And you can see the semicolon at the end. Model is where you actually write out the syntax for what your model is. And you're basically going to just use 3 syntax, with, on, and by. So with means create a correlation between these 2 variables. On means regressed onto. So the way I was kind of taught this is, when you're doing this, it's like Chinese, so you're going right to left. So if you look at your picture, you're going to start at the right end and you're going to go backwards because you're talking about what has been regressed onto this variable. So you're going to look at your exogenous variable over here and write out everything that has an arrow into it. This, on, and then all of those that have arrows into it. And then by is what you'd use to do a latent factor. So in the example we had above, you may say therapy, alliance by goals, tasks, and bonds. One other piece about this is it doesn't matter if you use commas or spaces, M+ doesn't care. So that's one other thing I like, because in SPSS I always have to remember what gets commas, what gets spaces. M+ doesn't care. So I usually just do spaces because I don't want extra stuff in my syntax. I just use spaces. Define is an important one, but really, I'm thinking about analysis. Define is one you typically won't ever use, but this is one where you can actually create new terms, transform variables here in M+. Typically, you're going to do all of that work in SPSS and have all of your data cleaning done ahead of time, so you'll have already transformed variables, created new, your composite variables and everything. You'll have already taken care of that. So typically, you'll never use the define command. Analysis, this one is important, but it's one you usually don't ever mess with. Until we get into a few things, you're really not going to, once we get into dyadic analysis, into moderation, you'll mess with this a little bit, but for the most part, you leave it just as is. And what you'll often see is type is general, estimation is ML. So ML is full information maximum likelihood, and general is, that's typically how you leave it. Your output is where you tell SPSS what you actually want to see in the output. Typically, and this is beyond what's normal. Typically, I mean, you can put in things, there's some really cool kind of outputs you can ask for, like SDDYX is asking for the just the standardized. Mod indices is a great one. You do mod indices and then you put 3.84 in the parentheses here. And this will actually tell you what changes you can make in the model to make it significantly better. So we'll talk more about that a little bit later, but there's some cool outputs you can do. There's also like missingness, where you can get patterns of missingness and see what that looks like, so you can make sure that you're accounting for missingness and creating correlations where they're most needed. And the rest of the other 10 commands are rarely used, so I'm not going to cover them. So here's an example of what this looks like. This is from one of the studies I did, where I was actually doing the testing just the latent factors in my model. So you can see data, and then here's the file name. You see variable, and then I say names are, and these are all the variables that are in the data set that I'm using. Use variables are, so for this one I'm doing the CFA, so I'm only using my composite variables of cohesion, consensus, and satisfaction. Analysis type is general, estimator is ML, these iterations and convergence you're typically never going to mess with. And you can see that it ends lines, each of these subcommands, with semicolons. So names are, list them all out, semicolon. Use variables are, list them all out, semicolon. Missing are, all, -99, semicolon. And then a semicolon at each of these. And then model, where I actually have my model down here. Something I kind of forgot to say earlier, but it was in the PowerPoint, is if you start a line with an exclamation point, anything on that line is a personal note to you. You don't have to end it with a semicolon. If it starts with an exclamation point, anything on that line, SPSS ignores, and that's for your notes. So I put a little note in here that this is my CFA for RDAS. My CFA for this is my relationship dyadic adjustment score. So I have A, that's actor, P is partner, so my dyadic adjustment for actor and partner by each of those. Here I put a little note that these are my with statements necessary for good model fit. And then I put these with statements because there's some error that needs to be correlated. So you can kind of see here what I'm correlating is satisfaction between the actor and partner, cohesion between the actor and partner, consensus between them. And then in one case where I had to do this in order to make it work. So, and there are reasons why these errors make sense. And then my output, I asked for my mod indices and residuals, and also SAM stacked. So this is an example of what that looks like. I'm scrolled down just a little bit. What's missing at the top here is my file name, which I called it latent structure testing same sex. So this is my same sex testing of the CFA model here. The last thing I'm going to talk about is the language generator. So I'm going to go back one real quick. If you click this M+ button here, there'll be the first line will say language generator. And that's a good way just to get the basic structure of the syntax all set up so that you know that the file name is correct and in the correct location, that your piece here on your analysis is correct. You will still need to write out your model, identify, there's actually some buttons you can click to identify some of the output that you want, but it'll set up the main structure of it, and it's really helpful to skip some silly errors like typing out the wrong file location or typing out the analysis part incorrectly. So that language generator is a good way just to get the basic structure set up so that you can then just fill in your use variables, your names of your variables, and then your model. So where are we going across this semester? Give you a little sneak peek to where we're going. The beginning of the semester, we're going to talk a lot about just how the rules around setting up a structural equation model, so around identification and estimation and a few other pieces. And then once we understand how to actually do a full structural equation modeling, we're going to start talking about a few different types of models. So we're going to talk about Once we do that, once we get through the full structural equation modeling so you all understand how to do that, we'll talk about APIM models, so actor-partner interdependence models. And these are models where you have matched pairs. So this can be men and women. It can be literally actor and partner. So in a lot of the research I do where I include same-sex couples, you can't separate out between men and women because you have same-sex couples. So you have an actor and a partner. And so you're looking at matched pairs in that way. Or sometimes you're doing parent and child, or therapist and client, or teacher and parent. There's a lot of ways that you can do these actor partners. And essentially what you're doing is the model on top is the exact same as the model on the bottom. And you're looking at that model. So like in this one, the model is how does relationship satisfaction impact parental engagement? And we're going to look at this. The actor part is the person to themselves, and then the partner part is the person to their partner. So I highlighted this in different colors so you can see the difference between the actor paths and the partner paths. So that we're actually looking at matched couples. So in this instance, how does men's relationship satisfaction, their reports of relationship satisfaction, impact their partners, so women's parental engagement? And you can do this for a variety of, this really expands what you can do. And also for MFTs, we're really interested in dyadic research. And in some instances, even triadic research. And you can add one more line here and make it triadic instead of just dyadic. So you have like actor, partner, partner interdependence modeling. But it opens up a lot of research questions, and it allows us to really get at the research we are really interested in doing. Not to mention just like, we're collecting data from multiple people and matching those people based on their relationships together. Multiple sample models, we'll cover this piece here. So this is where you, ANOVA and regression meet together. So for example, this model I gave earlier with alliance, therapist efficacy, and dyadic adjustment, a multiple sample will run this model simultaneously for multiple groups. So you could look at this model and look at beginning versus seasoned therapists. Is there a difference here between these? You can compare models. So look at this with EFT versus CBT versus Gottman. You can have 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 different groups, and it'll run this model simultaneously, and then you'll also be able to determine which paths are significantly different between those groups. And this is really cool stuff where we can get into really looking at the differences between models and groups of people and doing this. This is also a way to kind of a way to get at moderation in a way, because you can look at how models moderate these relationships. But multiple sample SEM. So we'll cover this later in the semester as well. And then we'll talk about longitudinal designs. There are a variety of longitudinal designs, starting with the most basic, where you're just looking at the relationship of variables across time. This is just a straight up path analysis, but we're just using time sequencing with our variables. To doing many other kinds of longitudinal designs, including crest log models and others. And then we'll close with talking about growth curve modeling and growth mixture modeling. Growth curve modeling really helps us to look at change across time. So essentially what we're doing is we take variables like this one, happiness at time 1, time 2, and time 3, that are taken at equal distance of times apart, and then we're going to model their initial level and their rate of change. So you can look at where people start and then how their happiness changes across time depending on where they start. And growth mixture modeling looks at actually like groups within that. So a lot of research around like relationship satisfaction uses growth curve modeling. Trajectory of client care, growth curve modeling has some great implications for understanding where people come in with their level of depression and then what their rate of change looks like across time as we give interventions. So growth curve modeling is a great application of using a longitudinal design to really account for where people start and what their trajectory looks like across time, depending on a variety of variables and factors that we put into that. So this is the end of this first lecture on structural equation modeling. Please sign up for online lab hours if you have questions. And next week, we're going to get into going over the review of the foundational knowledge that you need to do structural equation modeling.